The story opens with a pink-haired maid standing before the prince of the mansion, her maid uniform stained with blood. Calmly and without ceremony, she announces her return. The lord of the mansion, known as Reidrick, does not turn to face her. Instead, he gazes out the window of his office, a sly smile curling on his lips. "Well done," he says, his tone dripping with approval, calling her by name, Amanda. A few hours earlier, Reidrick stood towering over a man who bore an unsettling resemblance to himself. Clad in a sharp military suit, his hands rested casually in his pockets, while his bangs fell low, obscuring his eyes. The other man, kneeling before him, looked up and stated calmly, "I'll be going now." Reidrick placed a hand over his chest, a genuine smile softening his sharp features. Addressing the unknown man, he spoke with quiet conviction. "I'll be counting on you as my body double. You're the only one capable of carrying out this mission." This was no ordinary request. It came from the Empire's seventh prince, Reidrick von Amalthea, 20th in line to the throne. The unknown man, a body double named Shinel, kept his gaze lowered as he mirrored Reidrick's gesture, placing a hand over his chest. In a steady voice, he replied, "I hope you ascend the throne, Your Highness, and bring peace to the people of the Empire." Without waiting for a reply from the seventh prince, Ted rose to his feet and turned swiftly toward the door. Watching him leave, Reidrick slid one hand into his pocket and affirmed with quiet resolve, "I'll honor your request and protect the Empire." As Ted departed with a group of soldiers, Reidrick watched from the window above, his gaze steady. Turning slyly to his maid, Amanda, he remarked, "You should be grateful he devised this plan, sacrificing his own life. If he hadn't, you might have been the one to face Myron yourself." Amanda's sweet purple eyes met his, a flicker of confusion in her gaze. "If the prince had ordered me to kill Myron," she replied firmly, "I would have done so without hesitation." Reidrick turned away from the window, his demeanor cool, but his gaze stern as he faced Amanda. "The fight with Myron would be to the death," he stated firmly, "and I can't afford to lose you." Amanda, her expression unreadable, looked straight ahead. "Thank you for your concern," she replied evenly, "but it's unnecessary." Amanda strode toward the towering doors, ready to leave the room, but Reidrick's voice stopped her. "Keep an eye on Ted," he instructed, "and clean up after him." She paused, bowing her head in acknowledgement. "Understood. I'll take care of it," she replied before continuing on her way. Reidrick turned his back as Amanda quietly left the room, a playful smile curling at the corners of his lips. Placing a hand on the window, he gazed out, knowing that eliminating Myron would significantly improve his chances of claiming the throne. Staring out the window, he silently vowed to himself that he would do whatever it took to claim the Emperor's gift for himself. The country, its people, and its riches would all bend to his will. Later, Ted walked down the bustling streets, flanked by 4 soldiers, each with swords strapped tightly to their waists. The Amalthea Empire, blessed with the miraculous gift passed down from one emperor to the next, had given rise to the divine tree. Under its protection, the empire thrived. Ted looked up at the white castle of the divine tree, his teeth clenched in frustration. The castle, bathed in an innocent light, hid a dark truth beneath its facade. The townsfolk remained unaware that the divine tree required a shrine maiden, which meant a human sacrifice. The divine tree's shrine maiden was where Ted's sister lived. A lone figure sat on the grass, her long white hair falling over her face, obscuring her eyes. She appeared almost angelic in her serene stillness. Ted's relaxed hand clenched into a fist as he approached the castle gates, where 2 guards stood, spears in hand. Only select members of the Imperial family and those in power were allowed entry to the divine tree's garden. At that moment, those very people were locked in a fierce battle for succession over the throne of the ailing emperor. Ted approached one of the guards, who immediately straightened and saluted him. Without a word of greeting, Ted handed the soldier an envelope, his expression focused. "Duke Leroy Myron, 7th in line to the throne, slammed his hand down on the wooden table, his annoyance flaring. His brows twitched in frustration as he scoffed. "That's impossible." Duke Myron rose from his chair, his guards standing behind him, sensing the tension thickening in the air. Ted, however, remained seated, his legs casually crossed. With a calm tone, he addressed the Duke. "Do you dare question the words of a prince simply because he was born to a commoner?" The Duke hesitated, stammering, "I would never stage a coup against His Majesty, the Emperor." His two guards, outraged, spoke up, insisting that the truth would come to light once Prince Mikhail returned. They urged Ted to wait for the prince's response. Ted, unfazed, casually sipped his tea, the image of the second princess, Tanya, flashing in his mind. Her plan was to weaken the power of the first prince, Mikhail. Setting the teacup down on the mat, Ted closed his eyes, realizing that Reidrick intended to use Tanya's scheme to his own advantage. But Ted was certain of one thing. Tanya was playing them all as well. Ted stood up, his gaze meeting the Duke's, who was clearly frustrated. Without flinching, Ted calmly replied, "I'm not concerned with the first prince. I'm simply doing my job, arresting the rebels under Imperial orders." The Duke, drained of color, pleaded with Ted to reconsider, insisting that His Majesty would never give such an order. Ted shook his head, his eyes closing as he replied, "No matter whose order it is, an order is an order." In a swift motion, Ted drew a pistol, his blue eyes locking onto the Duke with deadly precision. With a chilling calmness, he said, "I wasn't given any orders to capture you alive." For a brief moment, the Duke and his guards were frozen in shock, their mouths agape, unable to utter a single word. Ted, however, remained unfazed. Casually slipping a hand into his pocket, he turned away from the stunned group, his sharp gaze catching sight of more guards approaching, swords drawn and ready. Ted couldn't suppress a smile. The Duke, growing desperate, slammed his fist on the table again, pleading with the prince to put an end to the madness. Ted, however, was now unmistakably outnumbered. The Duke unsheathed his sword, releasing a powerful aura. Defiance burned in his eyes as he declared that the young prince would not defeat him so easily. As the Duke's powerful aura radiated from his body, Ted stood a few meters away, momentarily surprised by its intensity. This was Leroy Myron, the brave general and pride of the Empire. It was clear why Amanda preferred to avoid facing him directly, but Ted had a plan. He knew the Duke was a cautious strategist who meticulously prepared for every possible scenario. However, there was one thing the Duke could never anticipate. Ted had concealed high-quality gunpowder within his own body. With a single shot, it would ignite with devastating force. The Duke's voice trembled with urgency as he pleaded one last time, imploring Ted to reconsider his actions. "You're a prodigy in magic," he reasoned, desperation in his eyes. "You must already understand the position you're in." But Ted stood unwavering, the barrel of his gun aimed steadily at the Duke. A sharp grin spread across his face, teeth flashing white against the dim light. There was no retreat now, not after the extreme lengths he had gone to in preparation. Without hesitation, Ted turned the gun toward his own stomach. The Duke's eyes widened in shock, his voice rising into a shout. "What are you doing?" he bellowed, panic etched in every word. Ted's piercing blue eyes met the Duke's, alight with unshakable determination. "Now, go and explode," he said coldly, his voice like steel. "Everything begins from here." The world seemed to hold its breath for a moment. Then, outside the Duke's castle, the top of the building erupted in a deafening explosion. Flames tore through stone, and dust-colored debris rained down, scattering across the ground. Not far away, Amanda froze in her tracks, her figure illuminated by the fiery light of destruction. The sudden blast held her in stunned confusion, her mind racing to make sense of the chaos unfolding before her. Amanda gazed upward, her expression calm and composed as the realization settled over her. Ted had carried out his mission to eliminate the Duke. Inside the castle, the scene was one of ruin. The Duke lay sprawled on the cold stone floor, his body trembling and barely clinging to life. Blood trailed from a gash on his forehead, mingling with the soot and dust left by the blast. His breaths came in ragged gasps as he tried to process the unthinkable. The prince had detonated himself. It was a move he could never have predicted. As the dust and debris began to settle, Amanda stepped into the wreckage, her maid uniform pristine despite the chaos surrounding her. In her hands, she held two short swords, the steel gleaming faintly in the dim light. Her expression was unreadable, her voice chillingly detached as she announced, "I shall initiate the cleanup." Without hesitation, Amanda stepped forward, planting her boot firmly on the Duke's stomach. She pressed down with deliberate force, eliciting a strained groan of pain from him. He winced, his body contorting beneath the weight, as her cold, neutral gaze remained fixed on him, unyielding. Amanda stood tall over the Duke, her boot pressed firmly against his chest, pinning him to the floor. Her violet eyes, cold and unfeeling, bore down on him with an intensity that chilled the air. Slowly, she raised one of her short swords, the blade catching the faint light and casting an ominous glow. In a voice devoid of warmth, she asked, "Do you have any last words?" The Duke, trembling beneath her, gritted his teeth as blood dripped steadily from the corner of his mouth. His breaths were shallow, his body racked with pain. "Even if you do this, nothing will—" he began, but his words were abruptly cut off. Amanda moved with lethal precision, her blade slicing cleanly through the Duke, ending his life in an instant. For a moment, Amanda stood motionless, her eyes closing as if to seal away any hint of emotion. Her once pristine maid uniform was now soaked with crimson, a stark reminder of the act she had just committed. With her mission complete, she turned away from the lifeless body, her mind already fixed on her next task, returning to her lord. Two more soldiers burst onto the scene, their eyes widening in disbelief at the sight of the fallen Duke. For a moment, they stood frozen, unable to fathom how anyone could harm him. Amanda moved without hesitation. Rising gracefully to her feet, she gripped her twin short swords with lethal intent. In a flash, she lunged at the soldiers, her movements as swift as they were precise. With a single fluid motion, her blades cut through them, leaving no chance for retaliation. As the soldiers collapsed, their blood spilled freely, staining the ground and her blades. The glow of her violet eyes intensified, crackling with faint traces of purple electricity, an ominous testament to her deadly resolve. Amanda's gaze flickered briefly toward the carnage before her, cold and detached. She let out a quiet sigh, her eyes still glowing faintly. "This will delay my return to the prince," she murmured, her tone as emotionless as ever. Then, she turned and stepped into the shadows, her bloodied sword still at her sides. Ted walked calmly through the shadowy expanse, a realm that felt like purgatory, its oppressive darkness weighing heavily on his mind. Whenever he used his gift, it drew him back to the memories of his past, a time he could never escape. In his mind, he was a child again, holding his little sister's trembling hand as she wept beside their father's bed. The air thick with the weight of finality. His father, pale and frail, managed a weak smile as he reached out toward Ted. "Ted," his father said, his voice barely a whisper, "you have to become strong as the older brother. You must protect Claire in my place." Tears welled up in Ted's eyes, spilling down his cheeks as he clutched his chest with one hand, the pain of loss carving itself into his soul. Swallowing back his sobs, he met his father's gaze, his voice trembling but resolute. "I will," he promised. "I'll protect Claire. I'll keep her safe." After their father's passing, Ted dedicated himself to rigorous training every day. He poured his grief into his swordsmanship, determined to fulfill the promise he had made. His sister, Claire, often visited him during his sessions, bringing a brown basket filled with lunch. "Ted, you've been at it all morning," she would say with a gentle smile, setting the basket down beside him. Her warm expression was a constant comfort, urging him to rest and take care of himself. Claire was 2 years younger than Ted, her kind nature and bright smile a beacon in his darkened world. For a time, the two lived together in relative happiness, finding solace in each other's presence. But their peace was shattered 3 years ago when tragedy struck. Their town was consumed by chaos as soldiers descended upon it like a swarm of locusts. Fires raged, reducing homes to ash, and screams filled the air. Amidst the destruction stood a woman cloaked in black, wielding twin short swords, her silhouette cutting a haunting figure against the flames. The soldiers didn't ravage the town out of mere aggression. They came for Claire. The Empire's goal was clear: to capture her at any cost. Ted and Claire found themselves cornered, standing at the edge of a cliff as hundreds of soldiers closed in around them, their weapons drawn and their intentions unmistakable. Tears streamed down Claire's face as she turned to Ted, her voice trembling with urgency. "You have to run," she pleaded, her hands gripping his arms tightly. The chaos around them grew louder, but Claire's resolve cut through the noise. Before Ted could protest, Claire acted. With a desperate shove, she pushed him over the edge of the cliff. Her final words echoed in his ears, a bittersweet command: "Stay alive." As Ted plummeted, the world seemed to slow. He stretched out his hand toward her, his voice breaking as he called out her name. But his cry was lost to the wind as the distance between them grew. When Ted finally escaped the soldiers and stumbled to safety, the truth of what had happened crushed him. Claire had been captured. Word soon reached him of her fate. She had been offered as a human sacrifice to the Emperor's miracle gift, chosen to become the shrine maiden of the divine tree, a position that bound her to a life of servitude and suffering. Ted's body lay limp on the shore, his breath shallow as he processed the brutal reality. He was the sole survivor of the attack that had obliterated his hometown. He barely had time to mourn before fate intervened once again. Reidrick, a man who bore an uncanny resemblance to Ted, captured him for reasons unknown. Soon after, Ted found himself forced into an unimaginable role, acting as Reidrick's body double. Reidrick's ambition knew no bounds. Despite his mother's low social standing, he was regarded as a prodigy in magic and harbored aspirations far greater than any of his rivals. His sights were set firmly on becoming the next emperor, and he was willing to employ any means necessary to achieve his goal. But Ted saw an opportunity within the dangerous game he was coerced into playing. By taking Reidrick's place and donning the golden ring with its distinctive green gem, a symbol of imperial authority, he could gain access to the sacred garden of the divine tree. There, he might finally have the chance to rescue his sister, Claire, from her cursed fate. The thought of her filled him with determination, his resolve hardening. With his power and his unique gift, he could turn the tide. He could save her. Just as hope swelled within him, his thoughts were abruptly shattered. A sudden jolt brought him back to consciousness, the haze of near-death lifting as he woke, his heart pounding. A radiant maiden named Freya stood before Ted, her long white hair flowing down her back like a waterfall of silk. A delicate, flower-adorned golden crown rested atop her head, and her white gown shimmered, complemented by gold bracelets that caught the light. Concern furrowed her brow as she leaned over him, her voice soft, yet filled with worry. Ted, are you all right?" Ted groggily sat up, confusion clouding his thoughts. The disorienting haze of his recent death lingered, making it hard to focus. Freya's gentle smile remained, though her eyes reflected her unease. "Looks like you died safely," she said with a faint teasing tone. "Are you feeling all right?" Ted pushed himself to his feet, one hand pressing against the ground, while the other rested on his knee for support. Without looking up at her, he replied casually, "Obviously not. I just died, you know." Freya's smile softened at his indifference, but she said nothing, simply watching him as he adjusted to his surroundings. Freya closed her eyes with a soft sigh, casually brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You should get used to it by now," she said, her tone light. "You've died so many times, this should be nothing new for you." Ted remained silent, his gaze distant as he processed her words. Not hearing a response, Freya opened one eye, glancing at him with a hint of curiosity. She met Ted's gaze, and in that brief moment, memories of their previous encounters flooded his mind, images of the times they had crossed paths, each one more vivid than the last. 3 years ago, when Ted was on the brink of death, it was then that the one who granted him his gift also saved his life. She appeared before him, draped in an elegant white dress adorned with gold stitching, her golden eyes glowing with a warmth that seemed to radiate from within. Ted didn't fully understand who she was, but in that moment, with nothing left to lose, he had no choice but to trust her. Freya noticed Ted's gaze linger a moment longer than it should have, and with a sly smile teased, "What's wrong? Is this really the time to be gawking at me?" A hint of mockery laced her voice. Ted quickly averted his eyes, his face betraying a slight flush. "Don't be silly," he replied, eager to steer the conversation away from the awkward moment. "More importantly, are we in the right place?" Freya rested a hand on her arm, her gaze steady as she confirmed, "This is the right place. It's your only chance to get ahead of her." Ted's eyes hardened with determination. The resolve in his gaze deepened as he nodded, reaffirming, "This is it. My only chance to get Claire back." As the sunny afternoon gradually faded into evening, the air in Reidrick's castle remained calm and still, until the door to the chamber was abruptly thrown open. A soldier, clad in gleaming armor with his face obscured by a polished helmet, stormed in, his voice echoing through the room as he called out, "Your Highness!" Reidrick, lounging in his chair, turned to the soldier with an air of mild irritation. One hand rested casually on the arm of the chair, the other tucked into his pocket. A sly smile curved his lips as he drawled, "You're awfully noisy." "What is it now?" The soldier straightened, his tone grave. "Your Highness, Duke Myron has been slain." Reidrick turned his back to the soldier, his gaze drifting toward the window. A soft chuckle escaped his lips as he casually commended, "Good work." However, the soldier shifted uneasily where he stood, his hesitation palpable. "Your Highness, there is something that concerns me," he admitted, his voice laced with unease. Reidrick's smile faded slightly, irritation flickering across his face as he kept his eyes fixed on the view outside. "What is it, then?" he asked, his tone clipped. The soldier hesitated before replying, "I can't say it aloud, Your Highness." "Please, lend me your ear." Reidrick closed his eyes, tilting his head slightly to signal the soldier to speak. The soldier stepped closer, leaning in until his voice was but a whisper. In a chilling tone, he murmured, "Your role is finally over." Reidrick's eyes snapped open in shock. The voice was unmistakable. How are you still alive?" he managed, his surprise quickly turning to anger. In a swift motion, Ted seized Reidrick in a chokehold, tightening his grip as Reidrick let out a pained groan. "You won't be casting any spells," Ted hissed, his tone icy as he maintained the hold, his strength unwavering. As Reidrick struggled against Ted's iron grip, the soldier's helmet clattered to the floor, revealing Ted's face. Reidrick's eyes widened in disbelief, his breaths ragged as drool began to gather at the corner of his mouth. Between gasps, he managed to choke out, "Why?" Ted's gaze was icy, his expression devoid of sympathy. "I won't die from blowing myself up just once," he replied coldly, his voice steady and unyielding. A sinister smile curved Ted's lips as he leaned closer, his piercing blue eyes locked onto Reidrick's. "I have a gift," he said, his tone almost playful, though undercut with menace. "The extra life system. As long as I have lives remaining, I'll just keep coming back." His words were punctuated by a low, ominous chuckle that sent a chill through the room. Ted drew his revolver with deliberate precision, pressing the cold barrel against Reidrick's forehead. His gaze was icy, devoid of any trace of empathy. "I've waited for this moment for so long," he said, his voice low and chilling. A faint smirk crossed his lips. For these 3 years, I'm almost grateful. Without hesitation, Ted pulled the trigger. The deafening crack echoed through the room, and Reidrick's lifeless body crumpled to the floor in an instant. Lowering the gun, Ted methodically removed his gauntlets, his movements eerily calm. He stared down at his bare hands, flexing his fingers as if trying to process the gravity of his actions. Beneath his boots, blood from Reidrick's body pooled across the cold stone floor, a stark reminder of the price of vengeance. Ted knelt and pried the golden ring from Reidrick's lifeless finger, its green gemstone glinting faintly under the dim light. With this, his path to saving Claire from the garden of the divine tree was finally within reach. Without hesitation, he slid the blood-streaked ring onto his index finger, the weight of its power settling over him. A sly smile crept across his face as he studied his bloodied hands, the symbol of his triumph. "From now on," he murmured, his voice laced with quiet resolve, "I am Reidrick von Amalthea,